When J. Robert Oppenheimer prepared for the Trinity test, the world's first atomic explosion, fire itself became an enemy to fear. The blast posed the risk of spiraling the test site out of control. To guard against this, Oppenheimer and his team needed a substance to control the flames. Their creation of fluorochemicals eventually led to the development of per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, commonly referred to as PFAS.
On July 27, the aircraft carrier USS Forrestal became a floating inferno off the Gulf of Tonkin when a misfired rocket ignited a chain reaction of explosions on its flight deck. Within seconds, fuel tanks burst open and fed roaring flames that consumed planes, munitions, and men alike. This spurred the use of aqueous film-forming foam, or AFFF, to combat fires, the main component being PFAS.
At Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, firefighters regularly trained with PFAS-based firefighting foams, often becoming soaked in the chemicals during drills. Over time, some of these firefighters developed serious illnesses. One of them, 60-year-old Gilbert Smith Jr., lost his life to cancer in 2015. This was the first death in Washington that was officially linked to PFAS.
In 2017, groundwater tests revealed dangerous contamination in the wells serving Airway Heights from the Fairchild Air Force Base. Instead of treating this as an urgent public health crisis, base officials framed the discovery as part of a routine review, softening the reality that for years, residents have been exposed to PFAS.
A local resident of the West Plains, Marcy Zambrisky, who lives just a few miles from Fairchild Air Force Base, suffered devastating losses when her husband, mother, and 2 dogs all died of cancer within the span of 1 year. In 2022, Air Force officials confirmed that her household water supply was contaminated at levels exceeding safety standards for drinking. Given the well-documented connection between PFAS exposure and increased cancer risk, it is highly likely her family's death was caused by contamination from PFAS.
While PFAS drifted through the air and water, it has also found its way into the earth beneath us. Biosolids meant to feed the soil were spread across the farmland as a gift, a promise of greener harvests and healthier land. But hidden within that promise was a poison that couldn't be detected. Over time, contamination flowed quietly through the land, seeping from soil to crop, from cattle to human, winding its way into the bloodstream of the West Plains itself, until everything was touched by one name: PFAS.
The truth to all of these seemingly unrelated stories lies in much deeper water.
PFAS contamination on the West Plains.
Can Spokane County build a bridge over these troubled waters?
Nationwide, 524 airports and more than 700 military bases, like Fairchild, have used AFFF during exercises and drills. In many cases, massive amounts of the foam were sprayed, filling aircraft hangars or across runways. The foam, washed away without any containment, allowed for toxic chemicals to seep into nearby soil, groundwater, and surface water.
The West Plains Aquifer is a vital and unique water source, but its porous soils and fractured basalt make it dangerously vulnerable. This ghost in the groundwater doesn't just linger. Every time the military base washed away AFFF, those toxic chemicals flowed straight towards the taps of thousands of people. What should be safe, clean water is now at risk, and the community is left carrying the burden of pollution it did not create.
PFAS, one of the main components of AFFF, also known as forever chemicals, are made up of nearly unbreakable fluorine-carbon bonds, which allow them to linger in the West Plains Aquifer and build up in the people, wildlife, and plants, with even small exposures having the ability to turn into long-term serious health risks.
While we are all in agreement that PFAS is an issue, proponents and opponents differ on how it should be addressed. While some want to build bridges to solutions, others are afraid the river's too wide to cross.
Proponents of taking action believe that PFAS has become more than an environmental issue and is a quickly growing concern within public health and local agriculture. And communities are already experiencing its devastating effects. We further argue that the West Plains needs not only to continue, but also expand their efforts to mitigate and remediate.
Opponents contend that efforts have reached their limit. Fingers are being pointed at the county, state, federal, and corporate levels, and the true culprit may be hidden in waters too deep and dark to navigate. Further complicating the issue, the chemistry surrounding PFAS is unique and simply too complex to warrant further action. Finally, financial burdens are problematic, as they rely primarily on state and federal funding.
Still, some of the nation's most important decisions have been shaped under uncertainty. In the late 1970s, when the environmental damage had become impossible to ignore, and President Richard Nixon signed an executive order that would reshape the nation's response to pollution and public health. The creation of the Environmental Protection Agency marked a turning point, a promise that the federal government would finally protect the land, the air, and the water that all Americans depended on from threats like PFAS.
From that promise emerged a wave of legislation, none more vital than the Safe Drinking Water Act. At its core was a simple truth. Safe water was not a privilege, but rather an essential human right. That right, however, would later be tested by contaminants designed to resist heat, time, and regulation.
Decades later, the cracks in those protections widened. Beneath the soil and within the groundwater of Spokane County's West Plains, an invisible and unyielding presence took hold, exposing the gap between environmental ideals and lived reality.
And for those living with that reality, the problem is far from resolved. Proponents maintain that PFAS contamination is a serious and growing problem that deserves continuing attention and action.
Across industries, companies are taking meaningful steps to reduce PFAS contamination and protect consumers. Non-stick cook pans have even begun to advertise PFOA-free labels, demonstrating that change is possible. These early successes show that progress can be made, and we should keep moving forward rather than slowing down. As Lao Tzu once said, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step.
Having PFOA-free products is just the first plank in what could become a bridge towards a cleaner living and a possible solution. Chemical exposures have been overcome before, and proponents believe that with continued research, it can be done again.
Slapping a PFOA-free label on a pan is a nice start, but it comes with a high cost. Reformulation, filtration, and water testing cost billions, shifting the burden to consumers and local communities. Ultimately, this is only a small step that hardly addresses the issue. PFOA is only one of 14,000 varieties of PFAS.
Opponents suggest that the costs associated with cleanup efforts are far too high, and with the lack of federal funding, they can't get behind long-term efforts.
Despite $200 billion in U.S. investment, the response is still falling short. Craig Vollasing of Friends of Palisades described it as a small pot of money in a huge sea of need. Every dollar spent in one place is a dollar not spent somewhere else. When billions are redirected towards aggressive PFAS cleanup, that money has to come from somewhere. What happens when a rural hospital closes, school programs are cut, and fire districts can't replace aging equipment? That trade-off deserves an honest discussion.
You can't put a price on public health, Cashley. Given the devastating effects on many people's bodies, young and old, it's absolutely diabolical that we're concerned about the cost. Protecting human health should be viewed as an investment and not an expense.
While the cost of these efforts raises valid concerns, many believe that protecting public health should come first, especially when other countries are demonstrating that effective PFAS management can be achievable.
Meanwhile, across the globe, other countries aren't messing around. France has banned PFAS in consumer products, slaps fees on polluters to help fund cleanup, and will ban PFAS in all textiles by 2030. Europe even tracks its forever pollution hotspots, and Australia outlawed major PFAS chemicals in 2025. While we're still debating labels and filters, sometimes it feels like the whole world is sprinting while we're still tying our shoes.
Sure, other countries are taking action, but labels and maps alone don't make water safe. Clean and safe just aren't the same. Politicians can claim safety while 4 parts per trillion and more remain in the water. That's not protection, that's a loophole. And just as COVID exposed gaps in our healthcare system, PFAS has revealed cracks in jurisdictional responsibility between local, state, and federal agencies.
Opponents, while sympathetic, largely believe that the contamination is too widespread, and the chemistry and geology is different from anything we faced in the past.
Bree Brinkman, site manager for Department of Ecology, warns there is no feasible way to clean out the aquifer in the near future. It would take resources equivalent to our entire national budget for PFAS and many years of work and research. And Paige, we can't help that the West Plains aquifer is especially unique because of its basalt and gravel geology, which creates a permeable environment that lets PFAS spread quickly and unpredictably through the subsurface.
Actually, Cashley, that's the first thing you've gotten right all day. Thanks to recent research done by Dr. Chad Pritchard at EWU, we now know how PFAS moves through those paleo channels. Turns out, the contamination has a roadmap, and we have the directions to track it down and treat the affected wells.
That research is a big step forward, Paige. Understanding how PFAS moves helps us target the problem more effectively. To fully grasp the urgency of continued cleanup efforts, proponents take into consideration the long-term impacts on both public health and the local economy. The long-term unintended consequences reach far beyond simple water quality issues, affecting residents, crops, and livestock for generations to come.
Before we expect others to act, we need to face the damage happening right here at home. PFAS contamination levels on the West Plains are 57 times higher than the national average. If that doesn't raise alarm, what will? Contaminated water seeps into our crops and onto our tables, turning the very source of our livelihood into a threat to our health and future. And rural landowners are left in a void between acknowledgement and action.
Local producers have been forced to alter operations after PFAS was found in their water. Some can no longer sell products such as eggs or milk, as PFAS has made routine production practices unsafe and unmarketable.
While these may seem like significant concerns, some plants, such as corn, alfalfa, and certain fruit trees, have shown a natural ability to absorb and filter PFAS. Adding filtration systems to production practices can also reduce exposure through livestock. Additionally, many older generations who have lived their whole lives consuming crops and livestock raised in affected areas tend to be less alarmed.
While this may be true, there are younger generations who will face the long-term impacts of PFAS. And they see cleanup as not just a matter of comfort, but as an investment in the health and the safety of the future. And to get it straight, even older generations raise concerns for their loved ones.
Paige, the river is gonna run and we can only watch. While it's true that many younger generations may face more effects from PFAS, fear of what might happen in the future shouldn't outweigh the reality that the situation is being closely monitored and regulated. Not every issue needs drastic measures. Sometimes, patience and proper management are more effective than panic-driven action.
Opponents argue that without accountability from the county to the corporate levels, progress towards remediation is nearly impossible.
Spokane International Airport and Fairchild Air Force Base both maintain that they were using directives from the FAA and Department of Defense, but that shouldn't absolve them from responsibility. Perhaps it's time for Spokane International Airport, Spokane County, and the federal decision makers who dictated the use of a known carcinogen to step up and do what's right for the residents of the rural West Plains.
Blame won't filter PFAS out. While everyone's arguing over who's responsible, families are still drinking contaminated water. It's time for the manufacturers to stop dodging and start fixing the problem. Clean it up, protect residents, and prevent it from ever happening again.
While we are all in agreement that PFAS is an issue in Washington state, proponents and opponents differ on how it should be addressed, with opponents pushing for fewer efforts while proponents emphasize the importance of further action.
Opponents argue that efforts have peaked and shouldn't be expanded. Blame is spread across local, state, federal, and corporate levels, powering the flood of uncertainty. The chemistry surrounding PFAS spreads contamination far and wide, and to further complicate the issue, the financial burden falls on our taxpayers.
Proponents contend that PFAS has become more than an environmental issue and is a quickly escalating concern within public health and local agriculture. Spread through water and biosolids, it affects wide areas, and communities are already experiencing its consequences. For the West Plains, maintaining current effort isn't enough. That effort needs to be continued and expanded.
At the end of the day, PFAS contamination isn't a simple issue. The costs are high, the chemistry is complex, and the impacts are real. Whether through cleanup, prevention, or innovation, one thing is clear. The challenge isn't just how to fix it, but how to do so responsibly. This leads us back to ask, can Spokane County build a bridge over these troubled waters? Thank you. Are there any questions?